Last time when we spoke, when we spoke, last thing we had, uh, it was this very grandiose question of what people look for when they read, and the topic that I think was probably maybe the richest of such a big kind of vague subject to discuss. Um, and the topic I saw most people respond to subsequent who watched it on YouTube or whatever was this idea of reading, in particular, reading, I think, through displeasure, which was a point brought up by Lisa last time of why do you continue to read when you're not enjoying something? And so, off the back of that, well, the other question, if we can assume that we read to find some pleasure in it, what does pleasure in literature look like? Uh, are there what different types of experience could qualify, etc. So, as I mentioned just a little bit before, when I finish my little kind of intro speech, I'm going to ask people to share if they have a particular, oh, hello, Noah, have a particular experience that they think of, or a book or a writer that they associate with a pleasurable experience, then, and maybe we can talk about that. In my effort to think about the topic, I kind of was thinking about different types of literary pleasure, and thought of a couple of categories. Now, my intention isn't to be too prescriptive or too declarative about what is and what isn't. This is just personal reflections, and obviously there's like gray areas and crossover between different things. But globally speaking, there's kind of like three or three and a half types of like forms of pleasure I was thinking of. The first one, I suppose, is the most basic, would be a kind of like very individual personal pleasure in reading a book. You pick up a book, and for whatever reason, you feel a strong uh, appreciation and sympathy for the book. Last time I kind of mentioned this experience of hearing a book that gets praised to the heights and feeling like alienated by not understanding it. And this first pleasurable experience would be like the opposite. I feel quite confident that you will have had an experience where you feel like, oh, this book feels like it was written for me. Like this connects so intimately with um, my interests. But even further, I think this sense of connection to like the rhythm of a voice, or Fernando, the rhythm of a voice, or like the rhythm of speech, of a thought pattern, or this kind of thing. And often it can go beyond, the surface level plot elements, or things like this. This kind of ease, this of a recognition of a text. I could think of examples of personal examples of like reading the first novel I read by Antoine Volodine. I had this experience of like, wow, this is just. I would make it maybe want to make a difference between. I don't like the idea of people saying it felt like I could have written the book. I don't think that's. I don't agree with that notion, because I kind of feel like, well, if you would have written the book, you would have written the book, and you didn't do it. But the sense of like, okay, this is perfectly in alignment with my experience, way of thinking, etc. Volodine was one for me. Another one would be so with Volodine, it was like Minor Angels was the first one I read, and then it had an immediate like absorption into his post-exotic world. Linda Lay is another one, a French writer who, when I read Les Évangiles du Crime, one of her, not her first book, but the book that she claims was when she really like found her voice as a writer. And yeah, I mean, it felt like engineered to appeal to the things that I was interested in. Part of then that individual pleasure, I think, also extends to discovering your taste, developing your tastes, understanding who you are a bit, or well, uh, coming to a sense of who you are at a particular time and place and those kind of things. I don't think necessarily it's essential qualities, but yeah, identification, recognition, uh, complicity, but that's just individual. Maybe a second type then of pleasure could be a more social pleasure. And I think there's a couple of versions of this. In that borderline between personal and social, I think there's something, and again, this was brought up last time in the last meeting, of seeing yourself as someone who is able to enjoy a certain type of book. Um, Having like a triangulation of other people's tastes and your tastes and adopting a role or adopting a persona or being yeah uh, coming into that understanding of yourself in relation to other people. There's also a version of this where I think there's a great pleasure to be found in, for example, knowing about a book with a huge reputation or a writer with a huge reputation. I think, Ulysses is a really good example. You'd be hard pressed to pick up Ulysses without having some sense of its significance and Joyce's significance and things like this. And then I think if you're able to read it and enjoy it, you have the pleasure of being someone who is an enjoyer of Ulysses or whomever, whichever book that may be. You have joined the group of people who can say, A, I read it, and B, I got it. Very, very enjoyable experience to go through, I think. Um, and that extends further and further the more you read, the more widely you read. I think you can even push it to the point where you go kind of beyond that and you get the pleasure of like uh being the taking pleasure in a book that no one else has read, but you get to that through going through all these other steps that people have that you share with people. I think there's also an element here of yeah, being welcomed into the group, being a select few, yeah, like I said, being the type of person who is an appreciator of certain kinds of writing, certain kinds of things. Um, and then that shifts into maybe a third kind, uh, where it goes from just being able to be part of it to being, I suppose, one term for this could be like the pleasure of the like initiate. Like, it's not just that you are part of a group who can understand it, but you're part of then some pleasure which comes from not just enjoying the reading experience, being able to enjoy the reading experience, but starting to pick apart why the experience gives you pleasure, which I think is a step that isn't an obvious step necessarily. And it's when I was thinking of it before, I was thinking of maybe it's like a creative or generative pleasure where you start to grapple with the mechanics of something, which comes from your initiation in knowing what literature is or how literature can work or a solid understanding of tropes and patterns and references and relational positioning of a text compared to its predecessors and contemporaries and that kind of thing. So yeah, this kind of like pleasure of the initiate. Uh, Being able to recognize how a thing works. Uh, I'm cribbing a bit from a conversation I had with Ben earlier from this, but this idea of being able to recognize patterns, to anticipate them, and then take pleasure in the realization of them. Um, that it's not disappointing or lessening to recognize what's happening, but that you can enjoy seeing the mechanism and seeing like the Rube Goldberg machine, everything fall into place and you have your the successful kind of realization of things that you can identify and recognize. So I was starting off with those are the kind of the three kind of like categories of pleasure, I suppose I had conceived of this very, very individual one, this social one, and then this creative, knowing, initiate type of pleasure. But I think obviously there's other types, other versions, other shades of all these things. One I wanted to mention in particular was again based off like personal experiences, but The pleasure of reading a text in a language which is not your native language, I think, is a particular and personally was pronounced pleasure because what I found happened when I was first able to read an entire novel in French was kind of being taken from a more or less like initiated pleasure of having studied literature and having worked in it, I suppose, and then starting to read in French and being like put like right back to almost like this very childlike, almost like naive form of reading because just to understand the words was absorbing all my effort and attention, and I didn't have the ability of this like remove or this intellectualizing distance. I was just following the action of the text, and even novels which I think if I read in English I would consider trash novels were incredibly enjoyable to read in French because it felt like that experience of being 9, 10 years old and picking up a book that was from my father's bookshelf and not really understanding in, you know, granular detail what was happening, but feeling like I understood enough to read the whole thing. The example I came up with from this was reading a novel written by David Cronenberg, which was published by Gallimard in maybe 2012, 2013, something like this. Um, I'm quite certain it's trash, and if I had read it, well, I wouldn't have read it in English. I don't think I would have enjoyed it. I wouldn't have continued with it. But it was one of the first books which I read start to finish and felt like I was really in it, really absorbed by it all the way. So that's another particular type, and I think the reason for ending with that one because it's to make a difference between childhood or naive reading experiences in a native language, where probably at the stage of which you're able to enjoy that, it's you don't have a sense of the pleasure of doing it. You're just doing it. But being able to like transport back into that, return into that was felt like a particular and separate thing. Obviously, we haven't talked about, you know, the pleasure of reading a horny book or that type of thing. Obviously, those pleasures exist also, or the an exciting novel, a gripping novel, etc., etc. But yeah, in terms of when I was thinking about like, yeah, what do I mean? Kind of announcing the topic of the conversation without having thought about it before announcing it. That's where I ended up with these kind of categories, I suppose, or types, sorts of pleasure. And that's about it for my spiel, right? That's about all I've got to work off from to begin with. Um, so going back to what I mentioned before, does anyone have an example of a book or a reading experience or a writer who they associate primarily with uh, the pleasure of reading them?
Well, I can offer one just because we were also chatting about this before. Um, and I think the writer I'll mention or the particular work I'll mention for me falls into a kind of pleasure that I think like is adjacent maybe to the first type you described, but um, I've been thinking about like the concept of the comfort read, or in general, like aesthetic experiences that people seek out in order to feel comfortable or to feel a sense of comfort, which I think is common for people, especially when they're selecting music to listen to, if they're feeling a certain type of way. But also people who like rewatch film or television, or indeed who reread novels. I feel that there is this is a subtype of pleasure that's interesting because I think it's also something that's probably pretty frowned upon if you're trying to take literature very seriously as something that's supposed to be kind of animating or challenging or something like that. Um, but I think about how in this example that I'm giving, when I read the My Struggle series, the Knausgaard novel, which is um, it's a great novel, but it's not a kind of incredible novel. But I read it over the course. I read it all entirely on the subway in New York, commuting to and from work when I was living there. And uh, what it provided for me was a kind of tempo that was either like in accordance with, or at least kind of supplementing the tempo of my regular life, and it became reliable as a way of yeah, it became something I could rely upon to give my, let's say, my commute at the very least, but also I would say like my days as a kind of like bracketing thing, a reliable cadence that I could return to as a source of, I think, in retrospect, as a source of comfort. So in addition to kind of enjoying whatever literary qualities there are to enjoy in that work, I think I was really enjoying at a certain level the comfort that it gave me as a kind of touchstone for that period of my year in the year when I read it. I think it was like 2017 or something. Um, yeah. Anyway, I'll stop there.
Do you think you would have experienced do you think it would have been as comforting if you had read it? Because again, this is coming off the back of a prior conversation, but like, would you have had the same experience if you had been reading it not as part of a routine of commuting, if you had been sat at home reading it, or if you had had like, if it didn't have that rhythm of your life, which is maybe contingent on where you were going and what you were doing and that kind of thing.
I don't know. I mean, yeah, I suspect that routine in general, which can in itself be kind of comforting because it's regular and you can become familiar with it. Maybe that was kind of the dominant thing I was experiencing rather than something like inherent to the text. But that's also a problem because I think typically with reading, I mean, you can read erratically, but I think that can be a pretty unpleasant experience. And I think a lot of people who like to read will read at certain times of day, or they'll, if they have a certain long work, they'll sort of, whether they plan it out or not, sort of read it at a somewhat regular pace if they can. Um, so yeah, it's hard to for me to dissociate routine as such from like the routine of reading and the
Mm.
various forms that might take. So I don't really know, but it was definitely comforting both as a routine, but also for I do think there was something particular to that book. I don't know if other people here have read it, but you know, uh you're really plunged into the kind of like mundane life of the narrator in a pretty slow way. It's not a like a breakneck book. I mean, I felt the exact same thing basically when I read In Search of Lost Time for the first time. It was in addition to being like an astounding, beautiful work that gave me cause to think very deeply about a lot of things, was also very comfortable for me.
Mm. That's yeah, that's I mean that's something I didn't mention before, but it was something that was on my mind talking about the idea of pleasure, the social element of pleasure, and then when it gets to a point or this like borderline between the social and individual, I suppose, of and this is something that came up last time in the like reading against displeasure. What does it mean to take pleasure? Okay, we have an example like Proust, for example, pleasure in its beauty and its like uh I mean mundanity is the wrong word, but like what you were saying about like its everydayness, I suppose. So what does it mean then to take from the opposite if you take pleasure in, you know, extreme or violent literature or that kind of thing? And I when I was thinking before about being the type of person who reads X, Y, or Z, um, I think there's that can happen with the subject, the topic of the book, uh, and or with any piece of art. I'm are you someone who can stomach you know how many ever hours of Wagner's Ring Cycle? Are you someone who can stomach French extreme cinema or something like this? Um, so then it's interesting to attach the comfort, yeah, to see comfort as the pleasure. Yeah. We were talking before also about this idea of place and the kind of physical experience of reading and associating the having the pleasure of a very like embodied pleasure of where you're reading and when you're reading and like the time of day and that kind of thing. This notion of like connecting your reading experience to the place or to the moments of your life, or especially with a long book, maybe a period or a summer or whatever, like that kind of thing. So again, that's another kind of gradation or a shade of a pleasure, which I suppose is the more personal side of this was this book, this work defined this moment in my life, these relationships, these connections, or whatever like that. Does anyone else have a particular example of a book or a reading experience that they connect to that they remember as distinctly a pleasurable one?
Yeah, there's a sort of a framing that may be useful, and you touched on it in your opening comment. There is a a sense that you have to find your place in the entirety of history,
Mm.
And it's a sort of a crushing realization, right? And so what you get from literature, in a sense, is a sort of a disgust over uh, a person's personal insignificance, right? And you can plug into it. And so when you say read a very erudite writer who does a lot of name drops, every name that you know helps you sort of coordinate your place within that book and toward the writer. Now, some of these books that you haven't read exist in a sort of like as cues, ambient, and so on, and you sort of pick up on them. So it sort of happened to me while reading. Fernando has a reading group, and we read "Exhausting a Place in Paris," so Georges Perec, and in a sense, you kind of sort of get what he's doing, right? How he's experimenting, how to do a film transition in text, and so on. But it's beyond the point. The point is that you haven't read it, but it clicks, and you sort of feel like you're not exempt from history. There is this additional, suspension of something that is alive and active, and you're welcome in it. So that's one thing. So that's the first thing you touched about, belonging. The second thing is we need to have we cannot talk about pleasure without commenting on how Christianity sort of created familial bliss as a sort of, like a, I don't know, the bias for your own identity. You may not be religious, but you're affected by the enormous, volume of affect that it produced. We read the Apocalypse with Frank
Mm.
Garrett, and it's all about very precise use of language and different framings of familial bliss, heaven and so on. And so the atomization that you feel, and you point in history, it sort of stems. The more atomized you feel, the more value one attributes to the familial. And so Freud is perhaps one of the most important writers, or inflectors in writing, since he was digging around that. I think that's also important framing. And for me personally, most pleasurable read was David Lynch's book. And it's a voice book. The thing you read about translation, what you said about reading a crap book that just has something, and that something is his voice, and I just feel a love for his voice. Well, it feels like he's there. He's dead, but it feels like he's there, and it's a totally constructed thing. It's in my head, right? I mean, he's dead.
Yeah, I think that's a really powerful feeling of feeling connected to a voice. Yeah. And again, I mean, this is bringing up something that was kind of touched on in the last conversation we had a month ago of I think even if you have a huge amount of knowledge, erudition, mastery over forms and reference and things like this, uh, I I would be fairly confident to say any book that I really felt that I loved had this other element, which even if you understood and could position a text in relation to X, Y, Z and the other, that they do the great texts, the texts that really have had a hold on me, and in that having a hold I would associate with being with a pleasurable experience, had something quite undefinable, ineffable, something other, and that if you could purely explain away how a text functioned and what it was doing and how it was doing it, and you were able to do that in an absolute way, that's for me personally, the pleasure of reading it would be diminished by that. There is an element of having a bit of surrender to, I will never exactly put my finger on what it is, but in somewhere in the interaction of all these things which I can identify, it produces this other effect, this uh, other sense of enchantment, maybe uh, appeal. I don't know, even to have you in a kind of thrall of something, um, which is not a logical thing necessarily, or not a clearly like definable thing. I want to read Rebecca's comment here from the chat. She says, pleasure in reading for me comes from books that make me stop reading, meaning books that provoke thought or dreaming, where I look at from the page and follow my own ideas or train of associations. Or books that make me want to write, so I put the book down and pick up a notebook. Books that inspire an energy that takes me away from the page. Recently, Ian Penman's book on Eric Satie provoked this response, and anything Kate Briggs writes does as well. I think it's really that's really interesting that the idea of pleasure in reading is not reading. That you can enjoy the experience of stopping is, I think, a very interesting idea. Thank you for that, Rebecca. And then we also had a comment from Alex. Alex, do you want to talk about this extra literary pleasure of where, when, etc., or how do you want to do this?
Happy to, if you'll indulge me. It was just, there's a few reflections on what people had said, and obviously when you mentioned about place, that was something that I'll actually start with. It was really interesting to hear Ilias talk about the sort of this covert, or even not so covert, sort of religious idea, because I think the metaphors we tend to reach for when we're talking about profound reading experiences or aesthetic experiences are those sorts of transcendent, religious, and pleasure almost seems like the poor cousin. I happen to have the pleasure of the text just helpfully at hand, and there's a line that Barthes has about desire has an epistemic dignity, pleasure does not, and this sense that pleasure, because it can be sort of co-optable by capitalism, all those sorts of things, it's almost that sort of poor cousin that we have to justify it. And the point Ben made about comfort reads, that we're almost a little bit uncomfortable about pleasure, qua pleasure. It has to be something richer, potentially in the ways we often talk about literature. But personally speaking, I'm like many people, I haven't quite finished Proust. I'm midway through Proust, but I found that the only time I read Proust is when I'm on a train, commuting for business. And usually it's a longer journey. So it's not just I'm going into the offices. I've got a team away day. So I'm solidly on a train for 3 hours. And it's become part of me. That's basically the only time I read it. I mean, it's there. I could find time, I could make time. But actually, it's that particular time and place, and that sort of creates something for me. And I think it's part of, I think it was what Rebecca might be alluding to in her comment there about, I find myself gazing out of the train window and seeing things passing by. I'm in that sort of contemplative state already because of the Proustian sentence, and then I'm transported out of that. And it struck me as sort of interesting that, again, to return to that religious idea, one almost thinks, oh, I transcended my body. I was so engrossed in this that I was no longer aware of where I was or what I was doing. And I thought, no, actually, I am sort of aware of where I am, but that's part of the pleasure, to call it that, of it. I'm on this train. I'm not doing anything else. I'm not even going to approach work. My kids aren't here. I find there's certain music that I'm if I try to listen to a different kind of music on my headphones, I can't. It's got to be exactly the same sort of early Renaissance plain chant type thing. And I find that I've created this whole scenario whereby this is just my time where I read Proust, and that creates such sort of an evocative sense, even just talking about it now, that is, I think, the power of that reading, experiencing in a particular place at a particular time, as a particular function of what you might be doing.
One of the books, when I was thinking of what to talk about, or just the topic of thinking of enjoyable reading experiences, a book recently that had a very particular effect. And the reason for bringing it up now, Alex, thank you for that. Thank you for that contribution. Is because when you mentioned this idea of being taken out, you've been taken out of yourself, you've been absorbed in the book. This is a bit of a hobby horse of mine recently. Since this book came out, there was a novel republished here recently, originally published in the 60s by a guy called Hubert Gonnet, and it's the story of it's like essentially a true crime story. I suppose there was a fait divers of a priest who murdered his lover, and because she was pregnant with his child, so he killed her in a graveyard, and then took the baby, the fetus from her, and then baptized it, and then made sure he wouldn't be recognized. And then he led the search for this missing girl subsequently. Several works of literature were based on it. Several writers. This was in the late 50s, I think, and this novel came out in 62, I think. And what what the novel does, in a certain sense, it's incredibly simple. On one page, you have the kind of maybe more traditional third-person omniscient narration of the investigation. And on the opposite page, you have the inner monologue of the priest, who is getting involved in the investigation, talking to the police, leading them to where he knows the body will be found ultimately. And one of the great things about the experience of reading it, and the surprising things, was that because the two texts are facing each other, it really forced you not to just be absorbed by the text, because you could literally read a sentence from the kind of omniscient narration, and then what it made you want to do, or made me want to do, was look and see what's the priest thinking when he's saying this in the interview with the investigators, or in the courtroom, when he's telling this story, what's he actually thinking on the other side. And the reason I was thinking this in particular as a pleasurable experience, because it kind of combined many of the things that I was thinking of in terms of categories of pleasure. It had themes which I enjoy, murder and, illicit affairs and all this kind of Catholic guilt. Very fun. I was reading it in French, which felt very satisfying, and it was a republishing of this novel. It was originally published in the 60s by this lost writer who had been forgotten and has been kind of resurrected by a guy with a podcast who made a podcast about forgotten writers, and thanks to his investigation, this book had been rediscovered and republished by a very, very great, a very cool publisher. So it had that kind of like cultural cachet. It was a bit like buzzy book. It was ticking all these boxes, and then it had this very simple but incredibly well executed device, which had this real like powerful aesthetic charge of, also on the one hand, a different or new experience. It was a thing that was unfamiliar. It had that thing of, how is he doing it? How is he pulling this off? Uh, what are the mechanisms at play here? But the reason for bringing it up now, in particular in relation to what Alex said, is that it was a very self-conscious reading experience. It was not the pleasure of absolute absorption and, oh, I'm so like in the text, because you couldn't read the text like that. It forced you not to. Whether you were like reading a page and then going back to the previous page, or whether you were flitting between the two sentence by sentence, everything about the action of reading had to become very, very self-conscious, and that was enjoyable in a way that I couldn't have anticipated it being enjoyable. So yeah, that was the example when I was thinking of this question of a text or a book people enjoy. That was part of it. That was the one I had thought of for myself. Ben has commented on, in response to Rebecca, to what degree is all pleasure and aesthetic appreciation reducible to the pleasure of creating, which we encounter estranged from us in the work of another, almost like a form of transference? I mean, knowing who we have here in the call, do any of the published writers amongst us, want to talk about this? Is aesthetic appreciation reducible to the pleasure of creating?
I think of them as distinct.
Mm-hmm.
The pleasure that I get from writing and the pleasure that I get from reading have significant overlap, but they're not the same thing. To your earlier question of a book that I experienced as pure pleasure, the first Barry Hannah novel that I read, Geronimo Rex, uh, it hit a couple of pleasure centers. So fiction, pleasure in fiction feels distinct to me from pleasure in philosophy or the social sciences. In philosophy, generally, when I enjoy a text, it's because I agree with the argument. It's, another stepping stone in the infinite path towards some sort of unimaginable enlightenment. And Alex was talking about transcendence earlier, that there is in fiction this dramatizing of ultimacy, this sense that a book is gesturing towards something unnameable, but fiction abdicates responsibility for articulating ultimacy. So it just dramatizes it. You just get to, be suffused with that sense of transcendence without actually, abortively striving towards it. And the Hannah book does, he, Barry Hannah has a social relationship with sense and logic, but like that ain't the one he came to dance with. So the way that he writes is it's like animating logic. It's just slightly askew so that every observation feels new and idiosyncratic. And what I appreciate as a reader of that is I don't think that way, and I don't know anyone who thinks that way. And getting to enter into his mind is really pleasurable. And in the same way that, I don't get sustenance from a like very extravagant bite of food. Um, I don't go to fiction for, moral or personal enrichment. It's just the aesthetic experience of something that humans can make, and that there's no, practical reason for. It's why, like, I don't know whether y'all feel the same way, but I often find myself describing a really good sentence as in the same way I would food, like that was delicious, delectable. Um, and I never feel that way when I'm writing. I'm never satisfied with what I've written in the same sort of way. Um, there's that Emerson line about uh, the thought returning to us with a certain alienated majesty. That's about as close as I ever feel to personal pleasure when I'm writing, that it's as though a line I've written that I'm satisfied with, it's as though someone I respect more than I respect myself wrote it. And I'm able to experience it as, a thought, not just as a line that is subject to editing. And yeah, I mean, somewhere between food and, I don't know, like the dance of a bird of paradise, how I how strange it is that we exist at all, and that we exist with every thought that can be thought. So, why not decorate our days with, the most like beautiful, ludicrously beautiful thoughts and sentences. Um, but yeah, I've certainly never written a sentence and thought to myself that I'm, hanging a trinket on the great pine tree of the world and thank you everybody. But I do feel that way when I read other people's work.
It's a really, I mean, uh, it's a really interesting difference of I kind of agree with the where you with what you said, Austin. I don't associate the pleasure of reading with the pleasure I get from writing. To me, they feel very distinct. And further, I would say I don't associate the pleasure I get from writing as I don't feel like it's the same pleasure as I get or could potentially get from translating. They're all very distinct. Um, and it's very, very rare that I would ever. It's very rare that if I'm enjoying a book, the notion that I would stop and want to write something or create something off the back of the thing I'm reading, that's a very rare occurrence for me. It might just be a personal, I don't know, obtuseness, but like I tend to find I'm only conscious of influences way after the fact. Um, and undoubtedly everything I read feeds into things that end up being written, but it's I can't think of a time where I've had an experience that Rebecca mentions of, oh, I'm reading this book and it makes me want to go and write. Um, we've been very focused, well, and that's my fault. We've been very focused on novels and fiction. Austin brought up there reading philosophy or reading social science. Genuinely, the idea of finding pleasure in social science is a new one for me, but I don't know. I don't read very much. Has anyone got anything about other types of text? I mean, I would also feel like maybe the pleasure taken from poetry is very different from the pleasure taken from fiction. Uh, I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that. A couple of other comments then. So Rebecca said, all reading is creating, I guess, or creative. Aesthetic appreciation and creating are intertwined. Question. It feels to me like the energy the writer put into the page somehow gets transferred to me, and I want to do something with it. Brigitte says, I find I can only read books that I know are somehow, however mysteriously, expanding my conception of how stories can be written. That's something that I felt I feel very strongly about what I look for in a book, or for me to get this is again something that we talked about a bit last time. Wanting a book or wanting a novel to show a new way of thinking, a new language for thinking, a new view of something. I think that idea of like expanding conception is really important for personally. Reading is successful when it makes me want to make something, says Isabella. I disagree with that one. I'm just being mean to Isabella, but I'm curious about the use of the word successful, because
I'm not surprised in the slightest that you disagree or that you're being mean to me either.
Just to be a prick, just being a dickhead.
Well, goes without saying. So I think because when I'm so reading is something which is quite difficult for me, and I won't continue with something that I don't find interesting because I'm running out of life for that. But mostly reading does something, and it produces something, and how I then pass that production. I know that I'm just not interested if it doesn't make me want to do something, whether that is, write something or actually make something, or, whatever one might find as a kind of response to one's jouissance, I guess. But yeah, it's that successful is a really tricky word, but it's the only way I can think of really to describe that kind of sense of conversation and the thing that makes something want to happen. It's like it sparks. If it doesn't, if it doesn't spark joy, I'm just going to sling it out. Sorry.
Oh, no.
I'm so sorry. I just couldn't help that.
Yeah. Okay. If it doesn't spark something, make me want to write. I mean, does that go for other artistic experiences, or is that specific to writing in one form or another? If you go to the opera, does that make you want to do stuff?
God, yeah, absolutely, 100%. I mean, it doesn't make me want to make opera, right? But it makes me want to. It makes me want to touch the magic. I'm sorry. I'm here as the queen of cheese on this, basically. But I think these, for me, these all tend to be really quite somatic or viscerally situated experiences, and that sort of sense of. So when something captures my attention, I always want to spin it into something else. And this often comes from reading, because, although it can be difficult, I do actually read quite a lot. But yeah, it can be, a piece of music, it can be, choreography, it can be a cake, it can also be reading.
Can I jump in with a question? Isabella, I'm curious, have you ever read something that you thought was so good that it thwarted your creativity?
Sorry, who's asking? I couldn't see.
I'm Austin.
Oh, hi, Austin.
Yeah, it's something that you thought was so good that, I don't know, you had to retreat for a while, reconsider how you wanted to approach a creative project?
All the time, of course. I read things I read things and encounter other things, other texts, which are amazing, which silence me completely. But it's like, the worm is still there. It's still kind of, it still turns, and it still kind of, gets you going. And I don't know. It's just that this is, I don't know if this is a very standard experience or not. It's just my experience, and it's very much about. I'm thinking about something I read. So, it's not like the best book I've ever read or anything, but I read Like a Sky Inside in translation last summer. And I was reading it in Paris, and it was set, in the Louvre. And I then went and I made work. I did some stuff in the Louvre, kind of almost as a kind of an automated, not an automated response, but I couldn't do anything else. I had to respond to it in some way by doing that. It doesn't matter that that's not necessarily, or at this stage, a public thing, but it really mattered to me that I worked through that material in some really practical, whether that's writing. And my book Fabulae obviously was a kind of an in conversation with my reading of Calasso. So but yes, it doesn't mean I make something immediately. I might just need to let it sit for 20 years, like I did with Calasso, and then come back to it. Or there are other things that I've reissued in the form of writing. Yeah, sorry, I don't know what else to say.
I think, yeah, Austin, the thing that occurs to me with this idea of like feeling struck down by something, perhaps is one way to put it. I like I recognize that feeling, or almost the kind of I don't know. You see something that's done so well, or realized so well, you think, okay, where else is there left to go? Where do you go after this has been done? Take, I don't know, Beckett's fiction or something like that. After the unnameable, what do you do? Like, who does anything after that, right? But at the same time, the world keeps turning, and you know, there comes a point where you can metabolize it maybe. But what I find funny about, not funny, what I don't feel myself is this sense of having such a concrete relationship between this book, this bit of writing has made me want to respond to it. I don't know. That's a very that feels a very alien experience for me. There's a creative, like, so another there's the creative act of reading, of engaging and reflecting and thinking on the text, but I don't know if I associate it if I associate it directly with the creation. We have a comment from Noor. Pleasure in poetry is so elusive. When I read poetry by some bygone master, Galib or Eliot or Shelley or someone like Goethe or Dante or Baudelaire in translation, I feel it's almost impossible to not marvel at it, to not derive pleasure from the sheer musicality of it, or from the cleverness of the language, or chuckling at a tart remark. But more and more poems make me rethink if the pleasure I've instinctively derived from poetry is merely confirmation bias, because a lot of modern contemporary poetry does not move me at all. The more I read a poetry, especially that being published today, the more I find myself questioning the seeking pleasure from it, something I've always instinctively done. Maybe, I mean, thank you, Nora. Albin, do you wanna jump in there?
Oh, I wasn't meaning to, but I
Okay,
sure.
sorry.
No, I was thinking of this discussion was making me think of there was a review William Carlos Williams wrote of a George Antheil concert of one of the, I forget one of the which one it was exactly, but it was a very noisy concert. Everybody hated it. There was, I think the review was written in response to a negative review that ran in the Times or something, and at the conclusion of the review, Williams mentions that as they're walking out of the concert halls, one of the audience members comments like, "Oh, that concert made me like walking into the streets of New York like makes me like walk the sound of the noise of traffic and the people actually now sounds nice compared to like what we were listening to in the concert hall." and Williams concludes the review saying, well, that's the whole point of that Anthiel succeeded that way. And I was thinking of that because that was sort of Williams' remark about modernism and the role of displeasure in modernism, which was, I think, somehow was making me think about how we got to this conversation, because I think that was how it started last time. I think it was Lisa Robertson was talking about reading against unpleasurable texts.
Yeah.
And what that means, and to the degree that the relationship between what quality and pleasure, to what degree is that necessary, or is displeasure actually almost a kind of necessity of a positive quality of reading. So just that was something with Noor's remark also made me think about.
I think there's I think you could make an argument of any intensity of feeling is can be pleasurable. Like the worst reading experiences are the ones where you couldn't give a shit about the thing you were reading, and it's makes no effect either way, one way or another. Last time when we were talking with like Lisa's point about reading through displeasure, and we had Mika also talking about kind of like hate reading-y type experience, which I think is a different type of thing, but it's animating. Like the pleasure comes from being animated by the material, I suppose. And a text that doesn't produce any effect one way or the other is probably what's going to be the least pleasurable thing to read, perhaps. I'm going to be a bit mean to Brigitte, and she says it's interesting to think about time and pleasure, how some works of art literature need so much time to be appreciated. And then you finish, Brigitte, with like Anne Quin, for example. But can you talk a bit about your reading of Anne Quin, or for example, in what sense? It's a bit horrible to put you on the spot, I realize, but
Oh,
if
I
you want.
guess I'm just a bit obsessed with Anne Quinn's passages. I guess I just mean as a society, how long it takes sometimes for the collective to I don't know, define a text as being, worth reading, or that it's widely admired.
Okay. Is that okay? And it like a kind of to reach a consensus of a text being pleasurable, perhaps, or yeah. Is that am I right in thinking that?
Yeah, or just like, just to take an obvious example, like Van Gogh, no one really appreciated him so much. But then it's interesting, maybe it's sort of like a chain effect of people admitting something is pleasurable and then other people also finding it in them to agree, whereas perhaps they couldn't place it as pleasure, their experience. So it's just interesting of thinking about just the evolving nature of how people respond to texts and art.
Well, yeah, and I think that's a really significant thing as well about time and place of when you read something, and uh, whether it's more like more collective or more individual. Enjoying a text at a certain time and place when having tried to pick it up before you didn't enjoy it, or it didn't work, or at a particular moment, that could yeah, that could certainly play into that idea. And sometimes I think you need examples. You need to be shown how to enjoy things as well. This is maybe part of the the social element of pleasure, of if someone you respect tells you that a book is great, maybe that changes how you approach it in the first place. We haven't talked about the pleasure of sharing literature either, which I think is also a very significant part of my conception of any literary engagement. The pleasure of even if, buying someone a book, sending someone a text of a quote from a text, even tweeting out a quote from a text, the pleasure of the shared appreciation in that way, that it's not just it's not just identifying yourself in relation to other people, but it's in yeah, share the pleasure of sharing, I suppose, is another part of that, perhaps.
Before we move,
Oh,
right?
one, Patrick, we'll come to Patrick first, and then Ilya
Yeah,
will come to you after.
No, do Ilya first. I feel like he's about to say something more proximate to what you just said.
Okay, cool. Go for it, Ilya.
So we've been dancing around the thing that I think is important to, say. So if you talk about pleasure, it's pleasure from satiety, right? So I'm not talking about literary pleasure. I think bodily pleasure, right? There is a pleasure after a meal, right? So, and then there is a pleasure which is intimacy and transgression, which are, like a push and pull thing. They're like inseparate, and they are a product sort of of religion. And then you have the pleasure of hunt and or of being hunted, which is a functions lust, right? So that's important. It's what Austin brought up and Isabella brought up. It is, though Austin brought it up more directly, what you get with functions lust is sort of what lets you fly, right? And so be it that either you are the one who's hunting or the pleasure of evading what is hunting you. When you talk about genre writing, right? So say a detective novel, you have you as a reader are trying to intercept the narrative, right? Its quirks and the writer is trying to intercept your interception. So it's the crux of successful detective novel. So, and it has a dynamism, right? So that's important. But at the same time, when you read something, be it good or bad, you have the ability to catch yourself before, you become influenced by it. So when we're talking about writers such as George Perec or Borges, so these writers do stuff with language that sets the language free, and so what you get is like an entire new paradigm to do your stuff in, what Isabella talked about, right? And I think that's like the ultimate pleasure, which is in its essence active.
The pleasure of being like, to have a new space open up for you. The pleasure of entering this new space.
So something that animates a part of you, that sort of sets you in motion, gives you, I think that Austin said about birds, right? It's like that, the frequency, the speed, the kinetics, the shifts, unexpected ones, and so on.
Okay. Yeah, Patrick, did you want to chip in there?
Oh, I don't know. I
Sorry.
think the hunter hunted thing is kind of weirdly relevant to what I want to say. I guess I felt inspired to speak up on behalf of like nonfiction or philosophy, since that was mentioned earlier. Because it's like I think Austin put it really well that like thoughts are beautiful, and so there's a lot of philosophical literature that produces a profoundly aesthetic experience in reading it, one of the more I'm a very anti-elitist person, but one of the more elitist thoughts I ever had was like, I saw somebody tweeted on Twitter about like, you know, being like made to read Foucault in grad school and pretending you enjoy it. I just thought, like, what kind of a cretin doesn't get pleasure out of reading Foucault? Like, Foucault is a beautiful, witty, intelligent writer. Like, I love reading Foucault. It's a pleasure to read Foucault. And another thinker that I think about, that I think raises interesting questions, is Adorno, whose writing is very dense and challenging, but can create a very strong and beautiful emotional response. And it's like, it's like one of the most affecting passages, I think, in any work of philosophy that I've ever read is like in Aesthetic Theory, one of the several passages where he talks about the concept of the shudder, and the concept of the shudder being like a kind of physiological response to an experience and to an encounter with an other, or with some kind of an otherness that is registered physically but mediated conceptually. And I think this gets at the heart of something, like, you know, you can see an artwork and the artwork can make you shudder. You know, but that can be like a very strange, why is this fictional thing caught? Why is this opera making you shudder? And it speaks to something kind of at the heart of the word pleasure, which is like, you know, the choice of the word pleasure, the pleasure of reading or in literature, sort of biases us to think about delights that are sort of like sensual or corporeal. Rhythm, music, satiety has been raised. But I think, and I would like really strongly insist, you know, that there's no ostensibly physical, tactile pleasure that isn't conceptually mediated. If only negatively so, by like this delirium of my senses cannot be conceptually ordered within my experience. Right. So that like thinking about the intimate relationship between concepts and pleasure is very interesting and productive. And, you know, it's just sort of like, you know, overthinking things, you know, is pleasurable. And people raise the question like, or you raised it, Tobias, you know, that it's like the proximity of pleasure and displeasure. And sometimes the only thing that distinguishes between pleasure and displeasure is whether you're inclined to do it again. And I would try to close going back to the image of the hunter and the hunted. Like the whole thing with Adorno is that sort of like art can reacquaint us, you know, with the sort of like physical and lived basis of concept. Like putting it very simplistically, there's a world out there full of objects and we try to dominate them with concepts. And the things that we think we need to, you know, dominate are the things that give us the shudder, like whether it's like an animal, whether it's a predator that's threatening us, or whether it's our own appetite that's something that we can eat, or whether it's the fear and inspired by like rain and thunder. So we create concepts to dominate objects, but if our concepts stop being responsive to objects, our concepts become objectified and they become objects that dominate us. And so we're in this perpetual dialectical struggle to like renew our capacity for conceptual thinking through an attentiveness to the priority of the object that we're trying to have a relationship to, and preferably one that is reconciliatory and harmonious and stimulating rather than like one of domination. And, you know, so like the shudder is this sort of like return of what he sees as this kind of like primordial sort of relationship to an object that beckons a response, that moves us. And that can happen through something physical or it can happen through an idea. It all depends on how many steps up the ladder of dialectical movement you want to go. Yeah.
Knowing vanishingly little about Adorno, is that shudder, is that connected, or does he talk about that in terms of like a romantic sublime, a sublimity kind of thing? Is it the like this confrontation of the sublime, or is it a different?
I think yeah, Adorno is very partial to the sublime, and he even has like a kind of polemical reading on the distinction between beauty and the sublime, where he's like, it's all the sublime, you know,
Okay,
because
yeah,
like because really moving beauty kind of challenges you to sort of be fractured as a subject in your encounter with this object that moves you. So that's always that always has a very high. That's something he valorizes. Yeah.
because I think, I mean, yeah, very rusty grasp on a lot of the more philosophical concepts, but that notion of a sublime encounter in art, and but specifically for the purpose of conversation in writing, is something that I really do associate with the a pleasurable experience of confronting this yeah, I don't know even how to describe, but like a fracturing of of a sense of self, a reordering of a sense of self that comes from the experience, high a purely aesthetic experience, or one that resets how you're able to patterns of thinking, or this kind of thing. So yeah, that's okay. The shudder, I like that. Does anyone else have any thoughts on that? Anyone who hasn't mentioned one want to mention a book or a reading, a text, a writer who they associate who produced a great pleasure for them? Um, Being a little bit sentimental to finish, well, almost finish, depending on if anyone else wants to speak up. Walking home this evening, I was walking across by Saint-Sulpice, and one of the books and one of the writers who I consider with a huge amount of reading pleasure in my life is J.K. Huysmans, and in his novel Le Bat, where he has this kind of stand-in for his stand-in for himself, who is writing a novel about Bluebeard, and he gets involved in kind of a satanic intrigue. Again, all these things which I find very, very enjoyable, but a repeating encounter throughout the book is him going of an evening to Saint-Sulpice and up to the apartment of the bell ringer, if I remember correctly, and having these conversations about the history of campanology and the church in France, and these type of things. And I have a very clear memory first reading that novel in university, in reading and translation, and having this idea of this is intellectual life. This is what you do. You go to Saint-Sulpice and you sit in the clock in the bell tower, and you discuss with these erudite people who are experts. And it is no small pleasure to me to be able to, on a Friday evening in Paris, sit around with a bunch of people and have this type of conversation. So there you go. It's a little cherry on the cake of literary pleasure, meeting a genuine pleasure to talk to you all this evening. I think we've been going for about an hour and 20 minutes. I don't know if does anyone have any thoughts before we finish? Anyone want to throw anything in at the end?
I was typing something in the chat, but I'm also aware I've spoken
No,
already.
go
So
for it. Don't worry.
well, I mean, I was just reflecting on, I don't think we've really talked all that much. I mean, there's so much to talk about, so certainly not criticism, about the ways in which pleasure evolves. And I'm thinking, when you're a child and your tastes are forming, and I think, we were all probably listeners to partisans of the Beyond the Zero podcast, where they ask about the gateway books, and it's the things that open up, later pleasures, and the sense that pleasures not a static thing, which, given how often it gets talked about, you're reading a book. Oh, I put the book down after a few pages, so I wasn't enjoying it. you know, that seems to be like a lot of people just go, oh yeah, of course, life's too short, you know, why push yourself through that? Well, you know, because the actually doing work can lead to pleasure, and that this is something that can be influenced by the choices you make, by the effort you put into it, and as you know, life events and coming back to things. And you know, Patrick's point about Foucault, which I was, you know, sort of writing about in the chat, like if I were in a grad school class and it was in a class I wasn't enjoying and I had to read Foucault, you know, my sense of the pleasure of it would be, you know, be contingent on I've got to do this essay, I'm going to fail this class. Whereas if I'm coming to it, if I'm, say, writing an essay on my own time that I want to, you know, that I'm wanting to do, then actually I go, yeah, because it's got a different contingency, I can go, yeah, I'm appreciating things in a different way. And I think there's lots to unpack, that sense of how pleasure depends so much on those sorts of contingencies and evolutions of taste. And just to round this off, because it was something you mentioned, I think, Tobias, right at the beginning about it might have come under the social category, but and I think it's when you're talking about Volodine, but I think probably lots of us have had that experience of a writer who maybe wasn't that well known, certainly not major canonical, that you discover and get obsessed with and go, oh, this is brilliant, because I think that's a way of then you starting to assert your critical judgment. Like coming to Joyce, for example, like there's no way everyone's aware of that. You're not going to be sort of going, oh, you know, my individuating taste as a reader is, you know, it's going to be shaped in some way. You know, it can't help but be shaped by Joyce, but it doesn't, I don't think, have the same sort of valence as discovering someone else. You go, oh, there's this whole world out there that, you know, lots of people aren't aware of, and I now am. That
Yeah.
then you start to get that sense of, well, this is my taste as a reader, my taste potentially as a writer, given that we've talked about, you know, this sense of wanting to you know, critically engage with texts, and you know, this my sense of what I think is pleasurable aesthetically.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think it's the more you read it, it almost becomes the like an inverse thing where you kind of want to, you almost want to be the only person who's enjoying something, because there you've reached some kind of unadulterated literary experience that's not fed off trends or influences or something like this. So this is something I really struggle with, is feeling very possessive about writers who I really love, and to a point of like, no one else should be allowed to appreciate them. This is my thing that I want to keep for myself, and that kind of thing. Which then again is it's a kind of pleasure of a bit of a possessive. I have this secret and no one else knows it, but I get to appreciate it for myself. Yeah. Uh, yeah. Any other closing remarks from anyone? Um, if not, thank you very much all for coming, for your contributions.